I definitely want to circle back to another pet phrase that I find hugely annoying among like people who are very unhelpful in this situation, which is they'll say like, oh, well, weren't those two consenting adults? So is there a legal definition of consent? Like there's a lot of murky understanding about consent. Yeah. Is there one?
Well, legally in Singapore, actually, no. There's no statutory or like law book definition really of consent in Singapore. We do have Section 90 of the Penal Code in Singapore, which says, which talks more specifically around unsoundness of mind or intoxication. So if the person who has to give the consent doesn't understand the nature and consequence of their consent, or like what will happen if they consent or they don't consent because they're drunk or because they've taken drugs, etc., that's it. You can't really consent. That's not a possibility. But again, that's a very narrow part of what consent actually is. And I think then we need to maybe look more broadly at what consent is. And I think there is a dialogue on the internet that talks about this consent being freely given, knowledgeable, and informed with informed agreement.
Yeah.
So it's the communication of agreement. So one person says to the other person, I consent, I agree to give and or receive, and in the context of what we're talking about, to give and or to receive sexual acts. And it's freely and voluntarily given. And it applies to everything. But if we're speaking about in the context of the law, although there is no sort of written this is exactly what consent is, what we can look to, there are some cases, local cases that give us maybe, I think, about 4 main points that we need to consider when we look at consent. So the first one is that the consent has to be voluntary, and it has to be specific to the act in question. So just because you consent to somebody kissing you doesn't mean you consent to somebody having sex with you. And this is a really, really interesting point of discussion, because actually about an hour ago when I was flicking through the literature on this, I saw a comment that said, well, you can't take back your consent. You can't, once you said yes, that's it. You can't say no. Or once you've said yes to getting into bed with someone, you have to have said yes. That means you've said yes to having sex with them. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
You can revoke your consent in the middle of a sex act. And from that point, after you've revoked your consent, it's no longer consensual. So it's always a moving point of discussion is consent. Stuff like if you have previously been in a relationship with the person that you're having this interaction with, again, you need new consent. Past relationships don't mean consent. And I think an agreement in the context of coercion or fear, again, how can you give consent if it's not free? It's not informed, really. I don't know what to do. I'm in a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And how do I move through this? Maybe the best thing for me to do in this moment is just to say yes.
Yeah.
But in the context of what it is, yes, you may have said the word yes,
but
you're terrified.
Given.
It's not freely given. It's not consent.
Yeah. I'm loving that. You've mentioned the whole FGKIA movement. And if you're a listener, you just have to look it up online, #FGKIA, to find out even more details about what does freely given, knowledgeable, informed agreement mean if you are wrestling with someone about what the heck consenting adults mean. Yeah, so I want to also get a little bit into what do you see are some unique cultural dynamics that might make handling sexual harassment in Singapore difficult?
I think for me, the first thing that it's not necessarily unique to Singapore, but I have seen that it's particularly a thorny issue, is the issue of shame around sex. full stop. I think that really brings in a lot of different aspects. So it is, we don't like to talk about sex with our children. Our schools don't like to talk about sex and or consent with our children.
Yeah.
They are now, thanks to lots and lots of campaigning by lots of amazing people, including Aware, what is now happening is that there is the start of a consent education happening in Singaporean schools. But I know that I never got that when I was at local
Neither
school
did
in
I.
Singapore. Exactly. I also, for this point, also went to school in England, never got that training. So again, it's not necessarily a unique to Singapore thing, but it is a very real problem. And that then means that from a very young age, children start to develop their sexuality at a relatively young age, and they then don't have a language around yes or no, or what are we supposed to do? What is this feeling? How do I interact with other people of the same sex, of an opposite sex? When I have these feelings, what do I do? If they say no, what does that mean? How can I protect my own bodily autonomy? How can other people protect their own bodily autonomy? So 101 from the get-go, we need a better comprehensive sex education. But the schools can't be the only part of this. Yes, it is a catalyst for change, and maybe it's sort of the easiest way and most effective way to just get everything out to the masses. But the Singapore context also then means that parents have been brought up without that language. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about anything to do with sex. The stork brings the baby. The stork brings the baby, gives the baby to the parents. Here's the baby. When do you really ever see people? Maybe it does happen. None of my friends would have received kind of a real discussion from their parents around this. And then that means that you feel a sense of shame speaking about it. And I'm not even talking here about the context of harassment. But then when you add on that nuance, when you add on I have this very, very difficult experience that has happened to me. I don't have a language with which to tell you about this because I don't know whether saying no is enough. But on top of this, we don't have a language of support, and we don't have a language of, oh, okay, how can I help you? I'm so sorry that this has happened to you. Instead, it's, what were you wearing? What did you say to them? Where were you? Were you drinking? And it becomes almost like an adversarial experience for the survivor. And you see this, all you have to do is go to basically any major news outlet, any story, any Me Too story, and look at the comment section.
Yes. I mean, as I'm listening to you, like this whole, let's put the blame on the survivor or the victim, like, oh, it must have been something wrong with you, something, actually, I don't know, like I hear it with this very Asian parent voice. Like, it's not even sexual harassment. It's like, oh, you got scolded in school. What did you do? Like you must have done something wrong. It cannot possibly be teacher's fault. It was you. It was all you. Or like, oh, I got bullied in the playground. Oh, why didn't you stand up for yourself? Like, you bad kid. And what do you see in that? Like the cultural context. Like, does that get in the way?
I do think it does get in the way. I think it makes it very, very difficult for survivors to report in the first place. I didn't tell my parents about what was happening to me for a very long time. I told my mother quite quickly, and her response was, you just need to get over this. I told my dad only after about a year because I was so afraid and ashamed of what he might say. And it was something that I think I didn't have the language, but because also in that time and in that space, I was in such a place of trauma that I was so closed off to the idea of anyone who might exacerbate that or who might make that anything worse for me. I was just like, I don't want to speak to people who might have a bad reaction. But these are your parents or these are your family members, and
Yeah.
If, as a family member, you want to be there and you want to be supportive to no matter what, if something bad happens to somebody in whatever context. But because we don't have a real dialogue around sex in Singapore and around that supportive conversation, it really, really prohibits kind of a nurturing discussion for survivors.
Yeah. Yeah. That word that you use, like a nurturing discussion, I think it reminds me that if any of our friends or family comes to us and tells us about such a incident that happened to them, like our first reaction, is it to nurture them, to support them, or is it to just try to overanalyze, like, oh, it must have been A, B, C, X, Y, Z. I think for a lot of us listening in Singapore, it might feel like, does this really happen at the scale that you think it happens? Maybe it's just a Western thing. We're overthinking it. Like, what would you say about that? Like, is it that prevalent a problem in Singapore?
I mean, healthy, yes. It is such a prevalent problem in Singapore. I think the statistics on this are absolutely insane. I think it's 40% of people in the workplace. Aware did a study in 2020, I believe. 40% of people have experienced sexual harassment. And that's almost half of us. And most people didn't really have any kind of positive outcome following this experience. Most people, if they tried to report it, much of the time nothing happened. 1 in 5 of the times where people did report it, nothing happened to the person who
Yeah.
was perpetrating the harassment. It's so, so scary. And I think another statistic, like separately to this, is if you look at the figures around consent,
Yeah.
and sexual violence in young people, like 1 in 3 people, young people in Singapore, have experienced some form of sexual violence.
Yeah.
1 in 3. So that's, look to your left, look to your right, it's somebody there.
Yeah.
So
And I
we
can
cannot say
already
it doesn't happen.
imagine like someone listening going like, but yeah, no one say anything to me what, or like I don't hear it from my family or friends. And I'll just circle back to, well, there you go. There is a culture of silence. There is a culture of we don't know how to talk about this. And maybe the fact that we have not heard anything about it is precisely the problem. It's all kept under the table, and then it comes out in survey results. Like, I mean, you talk about the aware one. Like I was looking up to prepare for this podcast, and there's I think in like an IPS or 2021 survey or something, and they interviewed like 1,000 citizens and PRs in Singapore, and I mean I thought the results were quite shocking. Like 2 out of 5 say they have been sexually harassed at work within the last 5 years. This is a 2021 survey. And the harassment is most often perpetrated by a peer or a senior in the office. Like it's
Yeah,
it's crazy that this actually
it's
happens
crazy.
and we don't talk about it more. Yeah, I'm just so struck by that.
And you just think about that in the context of that's just at work,
Yeah. Oh
just at
gosh.
work.
Yeah.
I have so many instances where I've just been walking down the street in Singapore, and this is just me and just one person. Like, and do you know what the interesting thing is that if you start being the person who has this dialogue, like, obviously I talk about this a lot
Yeah.
online, I talk about this a lot in general with my friends, I try and be as open as I possibly can. Very, very early, as I think I say quite a lot in any
Yeah.
kind of article that you read about me, my friends gave me quite a bit of pushback and would say, "Oh, don't talk about this online. This is something that's very shameful. You don't want to be the girl who was harassed at work. You don't want to put that on yourself.
Yeah.
Don't talk about it." I cannot tell you, within a couple of years, every single one of those people who said, "Oh, um, don't talk about it. You shouldn't speak to people about this," came to me either with a story about themselves or about somebody else who they said, "Can you please help this person who's..." It's absolutely heartbreaking and horrifying.
Yeah.
But I think it shows so clearly that people don't know how to talk about it. But then it means that when you become the person to whom people know it's safe to speak about these things,
Yeah.
people will really start to come to you,
Yeah.
and you'll really start to then realize like how the real
The
depth of this
scale of it
problem.
is crazy. Yeah.